The knife goes in. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. A 4th, a 5th. A storm of steel in the dim light of the portico. The air, thick with the smell of incense and old stone, is now pierced by the metallic tang of blood. The first cry is not one of pain, but of utter betrayal. A guttural, disbelieving rasp that escapes his lips as he sees the faces encircling him. Not strangers, not enemies, friends, colleagues, men he broke bread with. His eyes, wide with shock, find Marcus Brutus. "You too, my child." The words are a whisper, a final, crushing realization. The most powerful man in the world, the dictator of Rome, Gaius Julius Caesar, stumbles, his purple-bordered toga now a shroud, dark and wet. He collapses at the foot of a marble statue, not of a god, but of his bitter rival, Pompey. The irony is a final, cruel wound. The life drains from him, there on the cold floor, as the conspirators, their daggers dripping, stand panting over their work. The sun outside the theatre of Pompey is bright, but in this room, Rome's darkest night has begun. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we must step back from that pool of blood. We must journey to a Rome teetering on a razor's edge. The year is 44 BC. The Republic, a centuries-old system of government built on shared power and fierce competition, is dying. Its heart beats weakly, strangled by decades of civil war, corruption, and the ambitions of powerful men. And into this power vacuum strode one man, Caesar. Fresh from his military triumphs in Gaul, after crossing the Rubicon River in defiance of the Senate, and after defeating all his rivals, he emerged supreme. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. To the common people, he was a savior, a bringer of order and reform. To the old aristocratic families, the smell of his power was the smell of a funeral pyre, the scent of the Republic burning. The air in Rome was a potent mix. The sweet decay of flowers tossed in triumph, the sharp odor of vinegar from the aqueducts, the sweat of the mob in the forum, and underneath it all, the acrid smell of fear. Fear of what came next. Caesar's statues were erected alongside those of the kings Rome had expelled centuries before. He wore the laurel wreath of a victor, but whispers said it was a crown in waiting. He presided over the Senate from a golden chair. Every gesture, every honor he accepted, or was rumored to have accepted, was fuel for the fire. The emotion was not just political disagreement, it was a deep, visceral dread. The fear that the soul of Rome was being sold for one man's glory. And in the shadows, the conspiracy took root. It did not begin in the public eye, but in the hushed, private spaces of the city. In the lamplit atria of aristocratic villas on the Palatine Hill, the scent of beeswax and old wine hanging in the air. In the colonnaded walks of private gardens, where the murmur of a fountain could mask a treasonous whisper. The ringleaders were not wild-eyed radicals. They were the establishment. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a sharp, bitter man with a mind for strategy and a long memory for a slight. He was the fire, the driving force of pure, undiluted hatred for the dictator. And then there was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was the opposite of Cassius. Where Cassius was fire, Brutus was ice. A man tortured by philosophy and history. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, was the legendary founder of the Republic, the man who drove out the last king of Rome. That weight of history pressed down on him, a ghostly hand on his shoulder. His mother, Servilia, had once been Caesar's lover. Some even whispered that Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son. The relationship was complex, layered with affection and expectation. Caesar had forgiven Brutus for fighting against him in the last civil war. He had given him high office. He trusted him. This was the conspiracy's masterstroke. To have Brutus was to have a symbol. His name alone would legitimize the murder. It would transform it from an assassination into a righteous act, a tyrannicide. To win Brutus, they did not appeal to his ambition, but to his conscience. They filled his ears with the words of his ancestors, with the philosophies of Cato, his uncle, who chose suicide over living under Caesar's rule. They painted a picture of a future where Brutus would be remembered not as Caesar's favorite, but as the Republic's savior. The plan coalesced with a chilling precision. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March, the 15th, was chosen as the stage. The Theatre of Pompey, a location outside the sacred boundary of the city, was selected because Caesar's bodyguards would be less vigilant there. The weapon was not the sword, the weapon of war, but the pugio, the dagger, the weapon of intimate, close-quarters killing. It was a statement. This was not a battle, it was an execution. Each conspirator would be expected to plunge his blade into the body. There would be no single hand responsible. They would all be equally damned, equally bound by blood. The days leading up to the Ides were thick with portents and unease. Soothsayers were said to have warned Caesar of great danger. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his murder, of holding his bleeding body. The ancient texts speak of sacrificial animals without hearts. The very air of Rome grew heavy, electric with a coming storm. On the night of the 14th, the city was restless. Dogs howled without reason. The shutters of 100 houses rattled in a wind that felt unnaturally cold. The conspirators met one last time. Their hands were steady, but their hearts hammered against their ribs. They checked their daggers, hidden beneath the folds of their togas. The plan was set. There was no turning back. The morning of the Ides of March dawned bright and sharp. The light off the Tiber was a blinding sheet of gold, but it felt like a lie. Caesar awoke in his home, a pall over him. Calpurnia's nightmares had been vivid, terrifying. She clung to him, her voice trembling. "Do not go to the Senate today." She described the vision, the pinnacle of their house crumbling, Caesar bleeding in her arms. He, a practical man, was skeptical, but even he could not entirely shake the feeling of dread that clung to the morning air like a damp chill. He decided to send a messenger to the Senate to postpone the day's proceedings. The conspiracy, poised like a drawn bowstring, trembled on the edge of failure. But fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of irony. The conspirators, learning of his hesitation, dispatched their most persuasive weapon, Decimus Brutus Albinus. Not a distant ally, but a close friend, a man who had fought alongside Caesar in Gaul. He arrived at Caesar's house with a laugh on his lips and a lie in his heart. He dismissed Calpurnia's fears as the fanciful dreams of a woman. He chided Caesar. "Will you, the great dictator, be kept at home by a wife's bad dream? The Senate is assembled. They are ready to grant you the title of king of all the provinces outside of Italy." The words were expertly chosen, playing on both Caesar's pride and his political calculations. With a final, hesitant glance at his terrified wife, Caesar allowed himself to be led out into the treacherous daylight. He stepped from the relative safety of his home into the final act of his life. The walk to the Theatre of Pompey was a procession of ghosts. The streets were crowded, noisy, vibrant with life, yet death walked beside him. A hand thrust a small, folded tablet into his grasp. A warning. It detailed the entire conspiracy, naming every man involved. But Caesar, surrounded by the very men named in the note, never read it. He clutched the unopened scroll in his hand, a sealed prophecy. Then, a figure emerged from the crowd, the Cius Burina, the very man who had warned him of the Ides. Caesar looked at him, and with a dark smile born of either courage or fatalism, said, "The Ides of March have come." The seer's reply was a whisper that cut through the sidious din, "Caesar, but not gone." He arrived at the portico of Pompey's theatre. The statues of the old gods seemed to watch him with stone-cold indifference. The conspirators surrounded him, a flock of wolves in white togas, their faces masks of feigned camaraderie. Their laughter was too loud, their gestures too eager. They guided him, a gentle but firm current, away from his intended path and into the designated room. The atmosphere shifted. The public grandeur of the portico gave way to a more confined, intimate space. The light was dimmer, the air cooler. The scent of perfume from the senators could not mask the smell of their nervous sweat. Tullius Cimber, a known supporter, approached first. He pleaded for the recall of his exiled brother, grabbing at Caesar's hands, pulling at his toga. It was the signal. Caesar, annoyed, tried to brush him off. "This is violence," he snapped. His irritation was the spark. Casca, standing behind him, was the first to strike. His dagger plunged downward, a clumsy, nervous blow that gashed Caesar's shoulder. Caesar wheeled around, his eyes burning with a fury that was purely Roman. "Villain Casca, what do you do?" He caught Casca's arm, the blood already beginning to soak his tunic. But then the circle closed. A flash of steel. Another. And another. The world dissolved into a chaos of white cloth and silver blades. They came at him from all sides, a frenzy of patriotism and panic. The grunts of the attackers, the sharp intake of Caesar's breath, the wet, sickening sound of metal-piercing flesh. He stumbled, parrying some blows, taking others. His blood splattered across marble floors, across the white togas of the senators, across their faces. He was a stag brought down by the pack. And then, through the forest of arms and daggers, he saw him. Marcus Brutus, stepping forward. In that moment, the political pretense fell away. This was not about the Republic. This was personal. The final, intimate betrayal. "You too, my child." The words were not a curse, but a lament, a sigh of utter defeat. He stopped fighting then. He drew the hood of his toga over his head, a final, dignified gesture, and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, ensuring his own blood would consecrate the feet of his fallen rival. Silence. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence, broken by the heavy, ragged breathing of 60 men. They stood, chests heaving, daggers dripping, looking down at the body. They had done it. They had slain the tyrant. They were liberators. But the only sound answering their triumph was the slow, steady drip of blood onto stone. Then, a single cry from Brutus, meant to be a rallying call to the Senate. Liberty. Freedom. Tyranny is dead. The words echoed in the hall, hollow and unconvincing. There was no cheering. Only a stunned, terrified silence from the other senators who had not been part of the plot, who now scrambled over benches to escape the slaughterhouse. The conspirators were left alone with their deed, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of what they had done. They had killed a man, but they had no plan for what came next. The monster was dead, but his shadow was just beginning to grow. The body lay still. A pool of crimson, dark and thick, slowly expanded from the toga-shrouded form, its edges creeping towards the polished marble of Pompey's statue. The metallic scent of blood was overwhelming, a butcher shop smell that clung to the back of the throat. For a full minute, the only sounds were the ragged, panting breaths of the assassins and the steady drip, drip, drip from their daggers. Brutus's cry of liberty had died in the cavernous room, swallowed by the sheer, bloody weight of the act. They were not being hailed as heroes. They were being stared at by the other senators who had not been part of the plot, with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The script of noble tyrannicide was already tearing at the seams. Then, a new sound began. A low murmur from the portico outside, growing in volume. The crowd had heard the commotion. The rumor of violence spread through the city like a plague, carried on panic breaths. Caesar is attacked. Caesar is dead. The news was a tremor that became an earthquake. In the forum, merchants abandoned their stalls. In the streets, people froze, their faces etched with confusion and a dawning, primal fear. The stability Caesar had imposed, for all its autocratic weight, had been a known quantity. Now, the world was unknown. The air itself seemed to crackle with panic. Inside the curia, the conspirators stood frozen, their bloody daggers held aloft, a tableau of victory that felt increasingly like a crime scene. They had expected the Senate to rise as one and endorse their action. Instead, the senators were fleeing, tripping over their own robes in their haste to escape the bloody chamber. The reality of their isolation began to dawn. They had no army. They had no control over the treasury. They had only their daggers and a philosophical argument that was rapidly losing its power in the face of a corpse. In a moment of sheer, misguided theatre, they decided to march. A grim procession, they walked from the theatre of Pompey towards the Forum. Their blood-stained hands and weapons displayed not as shame, but as a badge of honor. They chanted liberty, but the people who watched them pass did not cheer. They backed away. They closed their shutters. The silence was more terrifying than any mob. Meanwhile, the other players in the drama were moving. Mark Antony, Caesar's consular colleague and most loyal lieutenant, had been detained outside by design. When the news reached him, he did not charge in, sword drawn. He was a survivor. He slipped away, a ghost in the chaos, melting into the labyrinthine streets of Rome. He knew his life was measured in minutes. He shed his senatorial toga, disguising himself as a slave, and vanished into the city's underbelly. His heart hammered not just with fear for his own life, but with a cold, calculating fury. The game was not over. It had just begun. The conspirators, arriving at the Capitoline Hill, barricaded themselves inside the Temple of Jupiter. They were not conquerors taking a citadel. They were fugitives seeking sanctuary. The high, cold air of the temple was a stark contrast to the bloody intimacy of the portico. The smell of old incense and dusty gold replaced the smell of blood. Here, the philosophical debates began in earnest, and the cracks in their alliance widened. Cassius, the pragmatist, argued for decisive action: seize the treasury, secure the loyalty of the legions, eliminate Antony. Brutus, the philosopher, vetoed it. To kill Antony, he argued, would make them no better than butchers. This was a surgical strike against tyranny, not a wholesale purge. It was a fatal miscalculation, a triumph of idealism over the brutal realities of power. They would negotiate. They would appeal to the people's love of the Republic. That night, Rome was a city of shadows and whispers. The streets were unnaturally quiet, the silence punctuated by the distant, frantic barking of dogs. In the homes of the wealthy, lamps burned late as families debated their allegiances, their fates. The fear was a physical presence, a cold knot in every stomach. What would dawn bring? Civil war? Anarchy? The revenge of Caesar's veterans, who loved their general not for his politics, but for his victories and his gold? The dawn brought Mark Antony. He had emerged from hiding, having secured a fragile truce. A meeting was arranged. The air in the Senate House the next day was thick with tension and unspoken threats. Antony, now safe under a promise of parley, faced the men who had murdered his friend and patron. He did not rage. He was calm, dangerously so. He spoke of amnesty, of peace, of preventing the city from descending into a bloodbath. He agreed that Caesar's acts, his laws, his appointments, would all be honored. To the conspirators, it sounded like surrender. It felt like victory. They believed, won. They had killed the king and the kingdom had acquiesced. But Antony had one request. A small thing, really. He wished to give the public funeral oration for Caesar. Brutus, against Cassius' vehement protests, agreed. It was the decent thing to do. It would show they were not monsters. It was the second fatal mistake. Cassius, watching Antony leave the chamber, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had looked into Antony's eyes and had seen not defeat, but a patient, simmering fire. The liberators had control of the hilltop, but Antony was about to seize the valley. He was about to speak to the people, and he held in his hands the most powerful weapon of all, Caesar's will and his blood-soaked toga. The Forum Romanum was packed. A sea of humanity, a low, anxious murmur rising from the crowd like the hum of a disturbed beehive. The air was hot, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and dust. They had come to witness history, to hear the fate of the Republic. On the rostra, the speaker's platform, stood Mark Antony. He looked tired, drained, a man bearing the weight of a broken world. Beside him lay a simple bier, upon which rested not Caesar's body, which was already on its way to the funeral pyre, but a wax effigy, a hauntingly lifelike replica of the dictator. It was a masterstroke of political theatre. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the figure who had been, until yesterday, the most powerful man in Rome. Antony did not begin with a roar. He began with a whisper, his voice cracking with a grief that may or may not have been real, but was utterly convincing. "Friends, Romans, countrymen," he started, his words carrying across the still square. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He spoke of Caesar's victories, of the riches he had brought to Rome, of the captives whose ransoms had filled the public treasury. He held up Caesar's will, a sealed document that pulsed with latent power. He teased its contents. "He has left to every Roman citizen 75 drachmas." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. 75 drachmas was a fortune to a common man. "He has left his private gardens, his arbors on this side of the Tiber, to you, the people, for your perpetual enjoyment." The mood in the forum began to pivot, subtly, irrevocably. Then, he turned to the effigy. He pointed, his finger trembling, at the replica toga. With a theatrical flourish, he raised the real one, the one Caesar had worn just yesterday. It was a stiff, dark, horrific thing, crusted brown with the dictator's dried blood. He held it aloft so all could see, a banner of atrocity. He shook it, and the crowd gasped as if witnessing the murder itself. "Look," he cried, his voice rising, finding its strength in anger. "In this cloak did Caesar fall. See the rent, the cruel cuts, made by your benefactors." He began to identify the wounds, not by the conspirators' names, but by the force of the blows. "This was the most unkindest cut of all," he thundered, pointing to a gash near the heart. "For when the noble Brutus stabbed, then Caesar fell." He had transformed the abstract concept of tyrannicide into a visceral, bloody murder. He had made them see the butchery. The crowd's murmuring grew into a roar of anger and grief. They were no longer thinking of the Republic, of liberty, of ancient virtues. They were thinking of the money they had just been promised, of the parks they had just inherited, of the man who had given them these things, now lying butchered by a pack of aristocratic senators. Antony, his voice now a weapon, drove the final, masterful blow. He gestured to the wax effigy. He had it rigged. As he spoke, he manipulated it, turning it slowly, showing it to the crowd from every angle, a macabre puppet. The illusion was perfect. It was not an effigy they saw. It was Caesar, reliving his murder before their eyes. The emotion in the square boiled over. It was no longer a political gathering. It was a lynch mob. The chaos was instantaneous. A scream tore through the air. Then another. The crowd became a single, furious organism. They overturned the benches of the senators. They smashed market stalls, grabbing torches, pieces of wood, anything that could serve as a weapon. Revenge. Revenge for Caesar. The cry became a chant, a deafening wall of sound. They surged through the streets, a river of fire and fury, their destination clear, the houses of the conspirators. The first target was the home of Brutus. The mob crashed through the elegant doors, their torches setting fire to the fine drapes, the polished wooden furniture. They found his wife, Portia, and only her quick wits and the intervention of a few loyal friends saved her from being torn apart. They did the same to Cassius' house and to the homes of the other leading conspirators. The night, which had begun with the conspirators safe on the Capitoline, was now illuminated by the flames of their own burning property. The message was clear. Rome had spoken. It did not want its liberators. It wanted its Caesar, or it wanted blood in return. The conspirators, watching the orange glow of the fires from the temple, knew their dream was dead. Their high-minded act of liberation had been recast as a sordid, jealous murder. The people had chosen bread and circuses, the tangible gifts of a dead man, over the abstract promise of a restored republic. Brutus, the philosopher, must have felt the weight of his ancestors' ghost not as an inspiration, but as a judge. He had acted for Rome, but Rome had rejected him. There was no choice left. As the city burned beneath them, they made the only decision they could. They fled. Before the first light of dawn could reveal their position, they slipped out of Rome's gates, leaving the city to the wolves. They were exiles, hunted men, their noble cause now a fugitive's brand. The dark night they had begun in a portico had consumed them, and the dawn belonged to Mark Antony and to the ghost of the man they had killed. The conspirators fled east, into the provinces, their names now curses on the lips of the Roman mob. They had imagined themselves as heroes returning to a grateful republic. Instead, they were fugitives, their path lit not by acclaim but by the smouldering ruins of their own homes. The air in their camp was no longer filled with the lofty ideals of Cicero's speeches, but with the grim scent of dust, sweat, and cold fear. They had the swords of their legions, but they had lost the war of hearts and minds in a single, devastating afternoon in the Forum. The ghost of Caesar, conjured by Antony's masterful oration, was a more powerful general than any living man. Back in Rome, the vacuum of power did not remain empty for long. The three men who stepped into it would shape the next chapter of the Republic's bloody end. Mark Antony, the charismatic executor of Caesar's will; Lepidus, a reliable general with legions at his back; and a young man whom almost everyone had overlooked, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son. When the news of the assassination reached him, he was across the Adriatic, a student, a boy. He returned to Italy not as a mourning youth, but as Caesar's heir, a title that came with a legendary name and, more importantly, the bottomless treasury of Caesar's wealth and the fanatical loyalty of his veterans. The smell of his ambition was a cold, clean scent of calculation, a stark contrast to Antony's fiery passion. The meeting between Antony and the young Octavian was a study in tension. Antony, the seasoned warrior, saw a boy to be brushed aside, a claimant to a fortune he intended to control. Octavian, who now called himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, saw a rival who had failed to avenge his father. He did not plead. He commanded. He used Caesar's gold to raise his own army from the dead dictator's loyal legions. The Senate, still reeling, saw in this precocious youth a useful counterweight to Antony's growing power. They gave him command. They made him a senator. The boy who had been studying rhetoric was now, impossibly, a player in the game of empires. The alliance he, Antony, and Lepidus formed, the second triumvirate, was not born of friendship, but of cold, brutal necessity. Their first order of business was not to fight the conspirators, but to purge their enemies in Rome. The prescription lists they posted were a death warrant for hundreds of senators and wealthy equestrians. The city, which had barely washed away Caesar's blood, was now stained again. The heads of the condemned were displayed in the Forum. The smell of death became routine. For Brutus and Cassius, watching from the east, this was the final proof of their righteousness. The Republic was truly dead, murdered not by them, but by the monsters they had failed to kill. They amassed a vast army, a last, grand coalition of the Republican cause. Their camp in Macedonia was a city of tents and hope, but the hope was desperate, brittle. The omens were bad. A great eagle, the symbol of legions, perched on Cassius' tent, only to be driven away by a flock of smaller, shrieking birds. Cassius, the pragmatist to the end, confessed to a friend a chilling premonition. "I no longer believe in the philosophy I once preached," he said. "I am in the same case as Pompey the Great, who was forced to engage in a battle upon which everything depended, against his better judgment." The two armies met near the insignificant town of Philippi in the autumn of 42 BC. The plains were a vast, grey stage, the air crisp with the coming winter. On one side, the liberators, fighting for a ghost, the Republic. On the other, the triumvirs, fighting for the legacy of a ghost, Caesar. The first battle was a bloody draw. Brutus's forces, full of Republican fervor, smashed Octavian's legions, overrunning his camp and forcing the young heir to flee and hide in a swamp, his life spared only by luck and the confusion of the fight. He ordered his shield-bearer, Pindarus, to do his duty. With the same finality he had shown in the Senate, he drew his cloak over his head, offering his throat. The man who had been the fire of the conspiracy died by his own command, a final, brutal act of control. The irony was absolute. At that very moment, Brutus's messengers were riding to tell him of his own victory on the other wing. He had won his battle, but lost his brother-in-arms. The Republic's last, best hope died not on the enemy's sword, but on a misunderstanding. The Second Battle of Philippi, fought 3 weeks later, was not a clash of ideals, but a slaughter born of grim necessity. Brutus's army was restless, its supply lines cut by Antony's fleet. The men could smell the rot of defeat on the wind, a sour tang of despair and hunger. Brutus, the philosopher, was pressured by his officers into a decision he knew was folly. "I seem to carry on war like Pompey the Great," he lamented, "not so much commanding as being commanded." The weight of his dead friend Cassius, and the ghost of a republic that no longer existed, pressed down on him. Brutus, watching from a ridge, saw his line begin to buckle, then break. The cause was lost. He had staked everything on one throw of the dice, and the dice had shown a death's head. He gathered a few close friends in the gathering twilight. His words were not of politics or philosophy, but of a man released from a terrible burden. "I am supremely happy," he told them, "and I shall die praising my fortune, for I leave behind a reputation for honor and virtue which none of my countrymen who have taken up arms against their fellow citizens can claim." He asked one of his companions, Strato, to hold the sword. With the same resolve he had shown on the Ides of March, he ran himself upon the blade. His last whispered word was said to be virtue. But it was an empty sound, lost in the moans of the dying and the victorious cries of Antony's legions. With his death, the flame of the Republic, which his ancestor had kindled, was finally, utterly, extinguished. The fallout was absolute. The victors, Antony and Octavian, divided the Roman world between them. The conspirators were hunted down, their families persecuted, their names systematically erased from public monuments. The damnatio memoriae was a second death, an attempt to murder their very memory. But the ghost of Caesar proved more powerful than any living conspirator. The man they had killed to prevent a monarchy had, in death, created an empire. His adopted son, Octavian, would soon become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The system Brutus and Cassius died to save was replaced by the very thing they had sought to destroy. The irony was a historical wound that would never heal. The debate, however, did not die on the plains of Philippi. It echoes through the centuries. Were Brutus and Cassius noble patriots or treacherous assassins? The question has no easy answer. They acted from a genuine, deeply held belief that the Republic was worth killing for, worth dying for. They saw in Caesar's rise the end of a 500-year experiment in shared power. They were, by the standards of their own class and time, correct. Yet, their act was one of supreme hubris. They murdered the one man who held the fragile peace together, unleashing 13 more years of civil war that ultimately led to the permanent dictatorship of the emperors. They tried to save the patient by cutting out its heart. The moral calculus is terrifying. Is it right to murder a tyrant if the act plunges a nation into chaos? Can a crime be virtuous? The conspirators themselves were torn. Shakespeare's Cassius declares, "How many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted over in states unborn and accents yet unknown?" He saw their deed as an eternal example for freedom lovers. But his own dying words at Philippi betrayed a deeper truth, a disillusionment with the very philosophies that had driven him. Brutus, the most honorable of them all, was haunted to the end, visited by Caesar's ghost who promised to see him at Philippi. In the cold, silent archives of history, the truth lies not in black and white, but in the bloody shade of that portico. The daggers that stabbed Caesar did not just kill a man, they stabbed at the very fabric of time, unraveling one world and weaving another in its place. The conspirators sought to cast Caesar as the villain in their play, but in the end, they became the tragic figures. Doomed by their own righteous hands, their noble purpose swallowed by the dark, unpredictable currents of history they had unleashed. They gave Rome its darkest night, and from that night, a new, imperial dawn was born, a dawn they would not live to see and would not have recognized as their own.